So, for tonight's message, as it was posted, it's about Sabbath. The Sabbath.
What's that?
We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why you're here.
So, in the discussion last week about rest and about what it is and why it's valuable, we can't really come and talk about rest without discussing Sabbath, specifically in the context of church and Christianity, because there's such a direct link between the two. In a lot of ways, the Sabbath was established as kind of a set means of looking at rest and taking time to rest. Yeah, children. Anyway, but it's going to be something that we're going to have to discuss, and it's something that's going to have to be looked at because it is pertinent. Because it helps establish a certain rhythm to life. Now, when we look back at the Old Testament and so on, we see in Exodus 20 where it talks about where rest is, or the Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments. In Exodus 20, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And even to give a further context to that, we'll even go look at Genesis in the creation story. I don't want to read about Canaan.
God gives a second reason for why the Sabbath is kept in Deuteronomy, in the parallel passage. Go ahead and read that first.
So in Genesis 2, it simply says at the beginning of the chapter, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing, so on the seventh day he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." So what were you going to go ahead and say, David?
In Deuteronomy, he lays out basically a different paraphrase of all the commandments, and then says, basically appended to the one about the Sabbath, that another reason why it should be so ritualistically important to the Israelites was because he delivered them out of Egypt, where they were never allowed a Sabbath.
Yeah. So, talking about the Sabbath and looking at the perspectives of what's in Scripture, one of the big things with it is looking at the reality that, one, it was a commandment, and the seriousness of the commandment was something that is oftentimes misunderstood. If you see Exodus 35, Moses assembled the whole Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things the Lord has commanded you to do. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day shall be your holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it must be put to death. Do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day." So there were points in time when this was very, very, very serious as far as how it was maintained and established.
So, on some day, God has
What was that?
on some day, God like it says like God let the fire on some day of Sabbath or something like that.
It's like militaristic rest.
What's that?
Do you want your mommy?
Like is Sabbath like a somewhat of a routine or something like that, like a savings?
I don't think he's ever read that before.
It's
He hasn't read the Exodus or that.
it's fine. I honestly just can't hear him over the kids. Like,
You just have to explain it.
yeah,
My,
like it's fine. Like I don't mind explaining it. That's the purpose of tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so for perspective on the Sabbath and what that is, so essentially there's 7 days in the week, and this was based off of the creation and the story of that. So for 6 days, we work, we live, we do the things that we need to do through the course of the week, and on the seventh day, we rest. Kind of like our present day is we have church on Sunday, right?
yes, every Sunday.
Every Sunday. That's supposed to be the Sabbath day. And unfortunately, that's kind of like the way that we claim to keep the Sabbath day holy, is by having church on Sunday. But in reality, what the Jews had established here, what God had commanded, was something further than that. It was more than having church on Sunday, it was about having the whole day dedicated to just resting and being holy, keeping it holy in this way. And there are a couple of things with that.
And by holy, it's like setting it apart. That's what that means.
Yes. But there are a couple of things with that, in particular to the nature of what it looks like to rest on this day. See, the truth is that, well, realistically, let's stop and consider who actually maintains a Sabbath day in this group.
You mean by not like doing the thing, not doing things on it?
Sure. It's who actually maintains like a Sabbath day. Who in this group like takes a day, sets it aside, and says, "This is my Sabbath day. This is where I'm going to devote it to God and resting."
I used to do that before school, but now
I-
all my days are school
That is
days.
my answer too.
Yeah.
I swear I can.
I don't keep a
Sometimes
Sabbath
Thursdays
anymore.
people need me. But like usually I'm like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not even gonna drive my car. Because I get stressed just being in traffic. I'm like, this is working.
Yeah.
So I try
understand
to do
that.
Thursdays.
Yeah. See, looking at the Sabbath and what it is, as far as like the biblical narrative and what we find in that, there was a commandment, there was a specific thing that God was having us look at and having the Jews look at and trying to set forth. And there's a lot of discussion about Sabbath throughout the course of the Bible. There were whole years of Sabbath. It depended on the circumstance and what we were specifically talking about, but there were times where the entire world, or all the lands would be left in a state of Sabbath. And basically it was just this opportunity for the land to recover. So they would take so many years, and then they would have a year where they just not farm.
Or they're supposed to.
No, yeah. But the point was that there was this intention of trying to create an opportunity for recovery to happen. And see, this series, again, like going back to what I said last week, the intention behind this series is like the last one, to create in us a circumstance where we can actually apply something to our lives in order to change the circumstance that we find ourselves dealing with. And I understand that, like, a lot of us run through this stuff where it's not convenient. We find ourselves dealing with the situation, like school is a great example, or if we have a really heavy work week. I remember when I used to work at Winco as an example, and they had me working anywhere from 6 to 8 day stretches, and then I'd get split days off, and then I'd be back to work again for another stretch. And the thing of it was that, like, that didn't create an ideal circumstance to go and have a day that I could dedicate to just chilling out. And the other part of it is, like, there are a few things to discuss as far as Sabbath and rest and what that looks like. Because there's this whole other side of it that the Pharisees took on, as we saw Jesus run into so many times, where it became this almost militaristic thing of you can't do all these different things. If you're doing anything at all, you're working. When Jesus was healing the sick on the Sabbath day, they came after him about that, saying, you're working. This is a sin. And looking at that passage in Exodus 35, it kind of gives a reasonable ground for them to be concerned. I mean, if the punishment for working on the Sabbath is death, that's pretty extreme. But the problem that a lot of us need to understand with that kind of mindset that stands back and says, well, I have to do this, is that it also creates a circumstance where we just perpetually grind ourselves down to nothing.
Yeah.
See, the point of the Sabbath, again, and I'll say this again a couple more times, the point of the Sabbath was recovery. See, in every body, in every human being, we find ourselves needing to recover from over the course of even just a week. Sometimes you have a stressful day. Just one day is enough to bring us down to a point where emotionally, physically, and spiritually we need to sit down. The whole next day we might need to, like, take away from work, school, whatever our obligations are, in order to just rest from the levels of stress that we've gone through. And a key point that God kept driving forward months ago when he told me about this series and specifically this message, something to hammer home to everybody, is this simple point. God modeled the Sabbath day. He chose it, picked it, said this is a thing that you guys need to do because it's something that he did, that he does. I need everybody to think about this concept for a moment, that the God of heaven and earth, the creator of all these things outside of space and time, takes time to rest. Yet we, who are physical beings of limited energy and capacity to function, we age, we degrade, our bodies decay with time. Our minds decay, our spirits suffer as a result of stress, anxiety, fear, work, all of these different components that comprise our daily, weekly lives, and yet we will stand up and say that we don't need this rest time. We don't need this recovery time. Or rather, it's not convenient to take it. And this is a very, very important thing to look at, because it's something that has been brought back over and over to me over this course of this week, where I've had to watch so many leaders in the church go through this thing where they don't take a Sabbath day. They don't take time to rest. Instead, they just keep pushing and pushing and pushing because people need them. And the problem with people needing you is that you feel an obligate aspect where you have to go help them. But see, in the process of taking away from your time to recover, you diminish your ability to aid them. It's funny because it was actually an episode of Scrubs that brought this to, that taught me this thing. Like, God used it to speak to me because I was very much so in that headspace. I always have been. I'm the oldest person in my family. There have been so many times where I felt like I've had to be kind of the scion for my family and friends, going and fighting and striving and doing everything that I can, pouring myself out on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis in order to just do everything that I can for them and for God in order to have some value in this world. And as a result of that, I've ground myself down so many times. There was one point where God forced me to take 8 months away from doing any church work whatsoever in order to just heal from the assorted collections of garbage that I had gone through. But he spoke to me at one point through an episode of Scrubs, of all things. But there was this point where this, one of the doctors, or rather one of the students, was just pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and she was trying to take care of everybody in the hospital that was under her care. And the problem was as she kept doing this, she was losing sleep, she was losing time, and as a result, her mind was suffering. Now she had this doctor who was mentoring her, and the doctor took a day off and wouldn't answer her phone, she wouldn't do anything. And this student thought that was horrible. She was just like, obviously you don't care. Until the day came when she mixed up medications and nearly killed somebody. Luckily that doctor saved her from that happening because she caught the mistake before the student did. And she explained to the student that the reason why she had that day that she would take care of herself was because in order for us to be able to give the best that we can, we need to take care of ourselves. See, if we're running ourselves into the ground on a consistent basis, it limits our ability to really help. See, as your mind and heart suffer and decay and degrade over the time and stress that it goes through, you'll constantly find yourself in this state that it makes it harder and harder and harder to think, to reason logically, and then as a result of that, your emotions kick on, and they become more wild. Your fears, your anger, frustration, all these different components, it becomes easier to struggle with these particular emotions. And that can lead to despair. Because as you push yourself and push yourself and push yourself, and you find that you're not actually able to meet your own expectations or to help others the way that you think you should be helping them or feel that you should be helping them, or even following God in the ways that you feel that you should be, but you're just too tired to do, you just fall into these places of despair that force you to look at yourself in a more negative light. All the while not taking in consideration the fact that maybe it's just your body needs rest, your mind needs rest. But instead you keep pushing. So it creates this kind of spiral that goes down and down and down until you either break or stop. You either choose to or you're forced to, whatever the case, you're going to come to a point where you can't do it anymore. One thing that I was talking to Heather about just a few days ago, because it pertained distinctly to her recovery, is just this point that there comes a time where we can't run anymore. See, everybody that gets a word from God, they want to start running and pushing and running and running and doing and going. So we get excited. Suddenly we have this kind of, especially for immature Christians, we have this kind of meaning all of a sudden, this value. We mean something to God, therefore we want to carry that because it's such an honor.
Meaning is like a drug when you first discover it.
Yes. But see, the problem with that is, in that immaturity, we often don't know how to take care of ourselves either. Or we have all kinds of presumptions about what He's going to do, not recognizing that this is something important to Him. So we push and we'll wear ourselves down. But I was talking to her about how many pastors I've had to see or leaders in the church that I've had to see where when they have to stop running, when they can finally get out of that fight or flight mode that has them pushing and going so hard all the time, that's when you see the real damage that they've been through, that they're carrying. That's when they have to deal with themselves and what they've been reduced to. See, it doesn't matter how strong you look when you're in the battle. When the battle stops and you're in peace and you are nothing but a ball of trauma, panicking at every move and motion. We look at soldiers and see this kind of thing all the time with PTSD. They can't hear fireworks without going into panic attacks or wincing once they've recovered to some extent. I had a friend who was in the Navy. He came from Iraq. Every time 4th of July came around, it was bad for him. He would hear every explosion, he would wince and have flashbacks to what he endured in Iraq. See, there's this thing with the way that we take care of ourselves and just how much damage we can accrue without recognizing how much damage we're actually doing to ourselves. See, this series on rest is here for this reason, that we do need to take care of ourselves. And talking about the Sabbath in particular, this is something that got established with the intention, making it a commandment even, because we don't recognize the sheer importance of this particular thing. And see, it's even to go further. As far as the Sabbath itself is concerned, we talk about keeping the day holy and even devoting it to God. And that moves us to a whole other context. See, on the one hand, we look at the rest part and the sheer need for this that we have. But see, we also need the time with God. See, one of the struggles that we have in our present day and age is that the concept of Sabbath is kind of an obscure thing, in that we look at it as strictly our day is set up, the days of our week are set up as such. We have our work days and then we have our weekends. Our weekends look like this. Saturday is our day to do whatever we want. Sunday is our day to go to church, and then then make up for the fact that we have a bunch of things due on Monday, so we spend Sunday after church making up for this. And obviously this isn't entirely true for everybody, and there is significant variation between people, but the reality is that we have a basis for this. It's something that's ingrained in us starting in elementary school, when we learn what a work week is, because we have a work week. We go to school on Monday through Friday, then Saturday and Sunday we have our days off. And if we're Christians, or if our families were Christians, they took us to church on Sundays. And whatever amount of church was time we had depended on our families. Some of us had families who were in the church, working in it, or having even built it. Others of us just had families that were, there. And they drug us there even against our wishes, and we went there and drew pictures while the pastor droned on in the background. But this was what counts as a Sabbath day, is that we spend a couple of hours listening to a sermon, then we go do whatever we want. That's not really what it's meant to be. And understand that's a broad stroke of generality. That's not specific to anybody in here. I don't know how everybody handles their Sundays. But the point is that there's a place for us to devote this day to time with God, hearing from God, spending it in His midst and in His presence, because it's in that midst and presence that we do find so much rest for our souls. And just to clarify something with that when I say like in His midst and presence, I don't mean like what we typically do when we hear from God, which is spending a lot of time asking Him about all the things that our soul is in unrest about, but rather seeking solutions about these things, or even just worshiping. If we can't set our minds at ease enough to just listen, then maybe we need to stop asking questions and just enjoy His presence for a little bit of time.
Can I add something to that? Or
yeah, of course.
Carry on if you had another thought. I've learned that when a child is born, they have usually an innate ability to rest. It's kind of their natural default state when they're not like hungry or something like that. But then just through observance of their parents and whatnot, there's like a mindset of learned, mirrored discomfort and agitation, and they see the stress in their parents' eyes and their mannerisms and stuff, and they naturally start to mirror that and lose their ability to rest in their environment, and then that just persists until they can relearn the mindset of resting.
Yeah. So, as far as what's being said, though, about the side of rest where we spend our time with God, seeking God in this, there's this point, and just to be clear about it, like there is also an aspect of it where it might be necessary to even take some portion of the day away from Him. Like when we talk about keeping it holy and so on, yes, there is the aspect of seeking Him and spending time with Him, but if it is to be a day of resting, there are some times where, because of where we're at spiritually, we can't actually rest in His presence as much as we would be able to. And I say this from personal experience because personally I'm that kind of person. There's a lot of redundancy. See, like for myself, there's still a part of me that's not entirely mature in the way that I interact with God. In that I still struggle with aspects of that old kind of taskmaster mentality where I see Him in this light of being somebody that's going to direct me to do things. So there are times and places where I need to take a break from Him in order to find peace, in order to find rest for my heart and soul.
I'm the same.
And this is something that happens with Christians. And it sounds bad, because we want to stand back and say, like, well, no, I find my rest in His presence. But the truth is that some of us actually find anxiety in His presence. And it's not because of Him, but it is because of kind of the way that we've been developed. Especially when we carry those mentalities of, trying to be good enough for Him. and not being able to drop that, it creates a circumstance where we are going to like struggle with him and being in his presence. He's not going to be the most restful being to be around. We can have our Sabbath day where we spend time with him, but we'll also need to take time away from him in order to really be able to be okay. And something to say to that is that that is okay. Because one thing that we need to understand and recognize is that we are developing in our walks and in our understandings of who he is. And it's only through that time with him, where we do spend time with him and learn from him and learn who he is, that we will be able to even overcome that immaturity in our own hearts and souls, and to stop seeing him through the lens of that pretense that we've existed in.
Do you think that's only early in a Christian's life?
What was that?
Do you think that's only early in a Christian's life that continues?
No. It can be something that you carry late into life, into your Christianity. It really just boils down to how you see him, and also like how easy it is for you to let go of the impression of somebody's character. There are a lot of people who kind of like doggedly hold on to their impression of somebody else. So if like, say for example, my first impression of you was that you were a bookworm. And yet over time I find that you don't actually read that much. Over time I find that you're actually a lot more free in your thought and motion and that you're actually not as pedantic as I might have initially judged you to be. However, because I maintain that viewpoint, it might take me a very, very long time to let go of that.
Yeah.
So, as far as God is concerned, we spend a lot of time being taught about commandments and about following them, being taught about what is righteous and what is not righteous, and that to be close to him we have to be righteous. We're taught a lot of things about what God values, or rather what we think he values, in what it looks like in order to be holy. And that we have to be holy in order to be near his holiness. And to be real, that creates a lot of false precedents about who God is and what he actually accepts in his presence and in his time. And as such, it can be really, really difficult to work that out in our own hearts and minds, to be able to receive his presence as he intends it to be, rather than it being I hate when this happens, when I have to reference one of those three prophets. Which one was it who went into the cave and
Elijah?
he put to sleep? Thank you. Elijah? Okay. Again, it's always that thing. It's either going to be Elijah, Elisha, or Ezekiel, and I'm not going to be able to distinguish between the three of them every time.
Elijah, and who else?
Ezekiel.
You know, like Ezekiel, we went in the lion den.
Wait, so there's two Elijah then?
So it's Elijah and Elisha.
Huh?
It's really confusing to me too.
Elijah and then Elijah.
Yeah. So with that one in particular, he went in where God took care of him. But see, even he had to learn how to be there, right? This was a prophet who had so much interaction with God, but he still didn't understand that part of God's character until he experienced it. We have to kind of have that opportunity to experience it before we can really appreciate it. Otherwise, we're just left with those pretenses that we carry. So, with the Sabbath day being what it is, it's important that we spend that time with God on that day. And that doesn't necessarily mean church. Honestly, church can sometimes be a distraction away from your Sabbath day. It can create a situation where you're actually more stressed out.
Yeah.
Like, my Sabbath day is not the day that I go to church. on my Sabbath days, I've tended to avoid church and church meetings of any kind, instead choosing to go out hiking or spending time in nature, where I can just talk to God and have time to interact with Him personally. And then also I'll go home and just relax, whether that's, watching movies or playing games or doing whatever, reading. It'll be whatever it needs to be in order to give my heart and soul time to rest, and my physical body time to rest. So it becomes this kind of thing. And on the one hand, church can be something that can be harmful to your Sabbath day. On the other hand, it can be a catalyst to actually inspire a deeper seeking of God and who He is, and where to meet Him. So it really just depends on you as a person.
I just am worried about it.
And see, we'll talk about rest in and of itself as a concept and what it looks like to rest in a couple of weeks. But as it pertains to the Sabbath, we're just kind of laying the baseline here of what it looks like. But there is a place of resting and what rest looks like for the individual, being something that varies from individual to individual. Whereas, like, for one person, going out on a drive might be an incredibly restful way to spend their time. For other people, it might be that spending time on the road is incredibly stressful.
Yep.
So they avoid traffic as much as possible because it is the devil. I go the opposite way of all these things with my days. So
Just go to Damascus or something.
exactly. So I feel you. I feel you.
Stop. Keep your hands off each other. You did.
Good. So, as it pertains to this concept, and just to clarify something here, like, we are talking about a personal Sabbath and taking one. Because at the end of the day, like, there's a lot that's here. There's a place for us to recognize that this was a commandment. That this was something that God has seen as so valuable that He would demand it of His people. But we also have to recognize that with Christ coming, His death and resurrection, there's a lot more grace over us than Exodus 35.
Yeah.
And see, one of the troubles that we run into is, again, we need to kind of look at this concept of Sabbath and what that's supposed to mean. Because we have kind of convoluted views of it. Again, our culture does not actually give us a great opportunity to do that. Mm-hmm. American culture is notoriously industrious. And even when we look at the ideas of, like, I still remember when stuff was announced about Europe and what France was establishing as what was an acceptable work week, or different European nations establishing what was an acceptable work week. A lot of Americans scoffed at that because it created a lot of opportunity for people to rest and relax, and it meant that they weren't working as much.
The
But that's the thing is, like, innately our culture has this very, 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 like, production-oriented mentality. It's not conducive to resting. I mean, if we're real about it, for people in school and at work and that have full-time jobs, most of the time the way it works out is that we spend our school days and our work days at school/work. When we finally get free of those things, we spend that time trying to recuperate from those days. Or if we're in school, we're doing homework because there's a ton of it. And then when we do have days off, they're devoted to working on that stuff that we weren't able to get done. Or doing the errands that we weren't able to get done. Like, I still remember my time at Winco in particular. Those days off that I had were spent doing things that I needed to get done. Running errands, getting things paid off, stuff like that. They were incredibly stressful. It was like I would go from the stressful work week, and on my days to be free of that stress, I would spend them being stressed out. This is a common thing with people in general.
It's totally arbitrary to have to work that much.
Yes. And one thing that, like, I personally had to learn, even in school, was like the importance of taking breaks, even to get away from the work that I was doing. One thing that I'd been taught by other people while I was in school was this concept of like, okay, well, you're working on something, but when it starts to get too much, it's time to go take a break. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour even, mellow out and come back refreshed a little bit.
You want to know something profound along those lines?
Yeah.
So there's a type of person like CEOs sometimes that love their work. There's nothing they would rather be doing. It seems like rest to them, but they end up developing psychological neuroses and get sent to psychologists, and the psychologists will show them the science behind like why it's proven that they will make more money if they take their vacations like they're supposed to.
Right.
And once they figure it out, it was not intuitive to them, but they realize it's true.
Yeah.
And then they get smart and start taking rest.
Yeah. Because that's a thing. I mean, again, that kind of circles us back to that point of just, if we can find that time, or rather, if we can create that time, it will ultimately be more beneficial to us than trying to push through.
Yeah.
So,
Shuggy has the baseball right here.
one of the last things to kind of go over is to look at the example of Jesus and where he went with this and what it looked like. So, as far as Christ was concerned, I've heard it stated that, like, one of the things with him was that he didn't necessarily observe the Sabbath. I remember reading that where he stated that he was when the Pharisees came after him about the Sabbath at one point, something that he said about how the Son of Man, effectively, he wasn't actually, what's the term? The authority of the Sabbath did not supersede the authority of the Son of Man. And while there's a truth to that statement, I'm not sure that that was actually something that was intended in what he was talking about at those points in time. Because at the end of the day, And Jesus did plenty of resting and recuperating away from people. There were a lot of times that he took to walk away and just spend time with God. Spend time in his Father's midst, resting in that. And ideally, this is where we find ourselves. But the other aspect of it, where he was going around healing people on the Sabbath, being within his Father's will. See, the reason why I mentioned like personal rest is because we established that point. Even like what David was saying about how these CEOs, they view their work as their rest. There is a sort of precedence to that in some instances. See, the thing that I think we miss with Christ is that he enjoyed so much being in God's presence, being in the presence of his Father and in his will, that he oftentimes, being there, healing these people, that was as much rest to him as anything else.
Yeah.
Because he was with his Father in those moments and in those times. Now, even with that stated, there's this thing to it where that can create a stigma for for us to kind of stand up and say, well, I should be that. And that's fine, but again, we go back to that point about maturity. And it's okay to not be as mature as we think we should be. Again, all of this is stuff that's developing. Children play and wrestle and they find rest in that. Adults don't so much.
Unless you're Tom Cruise.
Yeah. That kind of varies.
I guess they go for work. Yeah, because they get paid. It's like, no man, like it's my rest day. Of course you want me.
I think there's like a reality of like even just knowing your personality type, if you're like an extrovert or introvert, because that is going to be where you draw your energy from. And if you're introvert, like you're not going to get rested going out and being with people, even if God shows up, even if God does a healing, even if it's just like so amazing, you're still going to feel drained, like if it's in a time you need to recover. So I think that Jesus really, he kind of models rest of what it would look like for introvert and extrovert, because he has times where he goes and he models that getting away, it's just me and the Father. And then, yeah, he also is modeling getting out there and healing people. And I think for some people, like, especially like if you are an extrovert, like, you're not going to feel rejuvenated unless you go get some fellowship or you get whatever that looks like.
I wonder if Jesus would ever overthink things. Or if his intuition was better than that.
That's so right.
It's just like if you're extroverted, when it comes to rest, you feel recharged when you're around people. Introvert, you need to be alone.
Yeah. Even to an extent, just where you feel comfortable. Yeah. If you're comfortable in a crowd, like it feels good, you're probably an extrovert. Yeah. Anyway, so yes to all that. But even with what I was trying to say, there is a place for us to like develop in a lot of ways and mature in a lot of ways, and it's okay to not be in a perfect place of maturity. Like, that's fine. These things develop, they grow in time, and even like recognizing what is rest and what is comfortable for you, what is good for you in terms of being restful and productive on Sabbath day. There is like there's very much so like a time and space for us to develop into that and to learn what that looks like, to find kind of our stride in that. Because it's not easy. And the real talk of it is that this is something that will routinely come under attack. Like, at the end of the day, it's something that you're going to end up having to fight for. Because whether it's demonic attack, whether it's well-meaning people, there will be circumstances where you will have to decide between going out and doing something that will actually cause you more stress or resting, whatever that's going to look like. This is a thing that will happen.
Kind of a tragedy.
But it's also something that where we need to like be ready, and we need to value this enough that we're willing to actually fight for it.
Feels like Satan sets it up that way.
Yeah. Because at the end of it, like, it's for our benefit, and it's also for the benefit of the people that we work with. Like, this isn't something that God just set up for funsies or something like that. It wasn't a commandment or anything like that he did just because. It was because there was some legitimate reasoning behind this. I mean, if he's doing it, it must have some value. Possibly.
And what value is that?
To recuperate, to recover from everything.
Especially Satan.
Everything that's wearing you out.
Especially from Satan.
From Satan,
Oh.
from dealing with him on a routine basis, because he's extremely tedious.
Yeah.
Dealing with stress, with family, and how stressful they can be. From just drama that happens at work and in life. There are a lot of things that we need to recover from. And a Sabbath is an ideal way to do that. Even if it is just a day. And sometimes you'll need more than just a day. Sometimes you'll need a week. Sometimes you'll need a year.
To retreat.
And the thing of it is another side of that is if you feel God pulling you towards that, even if God tells you you've been at work for 7 years or for 6 years, it's time to rest for a year. Don't fight that. See, there's a thing that happens a lot where, especially when we've been running for the longest time, where we get used to running and we don't really see a world that doesn't involve us pushing and fighting and working. It's really kind of impossible. It's the same reason why a lot of soldiers have a hard time adapting to life outside of war. When they spend so much time in war, it's what they come to know, what they come to understand. Suddenly they're placed in a world that's peaceful. They don't get that. It's foreign to them. They've forgotten what it means to have peace.
You never.
Right.
So they always like to work on their people for their opinion on they don't want to to something like to what their people for their
I'm sorry. I'm trying really hard to hear you, but there's like some dude screaming in the room behind me.
Voice.
my
He's just singing voices.
Like there's no such thing as peace in this world. Like there's hatred and jealous and greed and stuff. There's nothing peace about this world. Like,
I see what you're saying.
like the one that like money is greed. Then God doesn't like that. So God wants everyone to be peaceful and not greed. Like you can't have more money than you can only have around. So that's what I think God trying to tell me about.
Yeah. And as for the subject of peace, comparatively, between a legitimate war where people are shooting at each other and dying next to each other,
Yeah.
if you're a soldier who's been living in that for 8 years,
Yeah.
and suddenly you find yourself, the war's over,
Yeah.
the truce has been made, and suddenly you're back home
Yeah.
where there's no more war. Comparatively, that's peaceful.
Yeah.
And that becomes a situation where you have to learn and adapt to a new way of life as a result.
So that's not called one.
Yes.
Can we do it though? Like, is it impossible to do that though? Is it impossible to do that though?
Is it possible to do that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, then how's that?
Yeah.
Like how?
So the way that we adapt is through this process of coming to know God and letting Him transform us.
Yeah.
I say letting Him, but which has value, but it also goes further than that. Sometimes it happens as a result of His Spirit being with us and in us.
Yes.
And that pushes through and changes us, whether we recognize it or not.
Oh.
There are a lot of people who receive the Spirit and it changes them, and other people will recognize it even if they don't.
Oh.
But it becomes this thing. And as we come to know God more and understand Him more, and we begin to mesh more and more with His character and His person, it changes us. It's the same way that, you know how they say that your friends,
Yes.
the people that you hang around with,
Yes.
they'll change you.
How?
It just happens subconsciously. You start to take on their mannerisms. You might say the same things that they say,
Oh, okay.
like that. It's the same thing with God, but it even goes deeper than that.
What?
You start to see the things that He sees, that He values. Whereas you might have started as somebody that valued material like money. You were raised to value money, but suddenly you start to see that you value things like love and family much, much more.
Yes.
Those are the kinds of changes that happen as you spend more time with God and start to see what matters to Him.
What?
And you might not recognize it, but suddenly it's there.
What?
So in this place of, finding peace,
Yes.
and even some of the purpose behind this Sabbath,
Yes.
where we're taking time away from life to spend with God, specifically to spend with God, it creates a situation and an opportunity for us to develop more with Him, to learn more about Him, and also to learn more about ourselves in respect to that. So this is where these changes happen. It's the same way that, as I was saying with soldiers,
Yes.
6 years in a war, and suddenly you're forced into a situation where it's peace, peacetime.
Yes.
You have to develop, you have to begin to adapt to this new life, because it doesn't make sense anymore.
Oh.
You understand that you get your mission, you go out, and you kill who you're supposed to kill, or you protect who you're supposed to protect. You do what you're supposed to do. It's very, very easy. Suddenly you're in a place where you just have freedom. Nobody's telling you what to do anymore. You get to just do things. And that can be petrifying, because it changes the whole paradigm. So, in this place of resting, where some of us are being called into that, taking this time to create a Sabbath throughout the week and where some of us are being called into more than the day of a week to Sabbath. There's a place where we'll find ourselves in situations that seem terrifying and seem strange because they're foreign to us in a lot of ways. Because the direction that we've had this whole time is going to be very different. And things are going to change, and we're going to experience God in new ways, which might seem odd because they're not what we're accustomed to.
You know what it's like? It's like a little kid that doesn't want to take a bath, but once he's in it, you realize he really likes it and doesn't want to get out.
Yeah. So, it may seem odd, but it will develop us to grow in knowing Him more in different ways than we have in the past, and even deepen our relationship with Him, as well as creating opportunities for healing to come, which again goes back to that simple point: recovery. We all need to recover at some point. We all need time to do that. Whether it's convenient or not, we need to.
I used to have that intuition, but I had people in my life, like my dad and stuff, that would just get on my case if I tried to.
Yeah. So I'm going to close it on that, and then we can just talk for a bit.